Hello and welcome to Water Stories, the podcast. I'm Eve Barro, and this podcast is a production of BioBAT Art Space. As we embark on each episode, we invite you to immerse yourself in exciting discussions that illuminate the vitality of water, echoing the themes explored by the artists featured in our Brooklyn exhibition on show until June 2025. Enjoy! We're speaking with Astrida Neimanis. Astrida Neimanis is an interdisciplinary scholar in the field of feminist environmental studies. She's an associate professor of English and cultural studies, gender, women, and sexuality studies at the University of British Columbia. She's also the Canada Research Chair in Feminist Environmental Humanities. Her research focuses on bodies, water, and weather, and how they can help us reimagine justice, care, responsibility, and relation in the time of climate catastrophe. Her research also looks at how science and arts and humanities come together to address ecological questions and issues in new ways. She wrote and contributed to several books on the philosophy of water, including Bodies of Water, Post-Human Feminist Phenomenology, published in 2017, and Thinking with Water, published in 2013. Astrida, thank you so much for joining us and spending a bit of time with us today. We're very excited to hear more about your work and water explorations.
Oh, it's my pleasure. It's very nice to meet you.
And so I wanted to start off by asking you about your journey into water philosophy and its implication in terms of how we relate to each other and to ourselves. So I'm wondering if you could tell us a bit more about how and why you started doing this research.
So I was always interested in feminist questions of embodiment. I'm very fascinated by these remarkable things that are our bodies that we live with so intimately, yet continue to surprise us, that we try to control but never quite can, that are both entirely familiar and completely enigmatic, and they're miraculous. Like they're seriously miraculous things. So from a feminist perspective, I had always been interested in thinking about what a body can do, what a body is, what it might mean to think from the perspective of differently gendered bodies, and what that teaches us about difference and connection and all sorts of things. So my work on bodies of water definitely came out of this feminist lineage. Why did I start thinking about water is probably a little bit more personal. I've always loved to swim. I didn't grow up near the ocean. I grew up in southwestern Ontario in a town called Hamilton. It's a heavily industrialized city. It's right in, the armpit of the Great Lakes, St. Lawrence watershed. So I grew up surrounded by, probably the most abundant fresh water in the world. Yet I couldn't swim in it. I couldn't fish in it. I couldn't drink from it. It was really like you're beside all of this water, yet it is so polluted and toxic that you don't even really acknowledge that it's there. And when I started to think about this, as I became an adult, being subjected to all sorts of jokes about being from Hamilton, Steel Town, how smelly it is and stinky it is, and I became curious about this. As I also grew into adulthood, I started to understand that I was also living on stolen Indigenous territories of the Six Nations, the Haudenosaunee and the Anishinaabe, where I grew up, that, communities not a 20-minute drive from my, middle-class household didn't have access to drinking water, and again, in this hugely abundant location of fresh water. So these more political questions and these questions of environmental justice merged with my feminist interest in embodiment, and I started to think about ourselves as bodies of water and became curious about the exchange not only between human bodies, through questions of birth or gestation or breastfeeding, but how those human bodies are, of course, plugged into a much more complex, fascinating, and fraught hydrological cycle, which included the lakes, the rivers, the groundwater, the rain, animal bodies, plant bodies. And I started to become curious about the ways that this water was, sucked up by all different kinds of bodies and then given back to the world and to other bodies, but often changed. So, from a feminist point of view, then I was interested in developing a feminist environmental ethic, starting from the point of view of being a watery body. What does that obligate us to? What does that make us responsible for? How are we accountable to other bodies of water as bodies of water? And also, how does that completely explode any idea of human exceptionalism or human separation from so-called nature, which, many cultures and sciences and cosmologies have never taken to be the case, but in the Western sort of mindset that I was raised in, we were very much considered as separate from nature.
That is fascinating. I feel like I have 100 million new questions now. So I guess my next question, which you already sort of touched upon, but I'm curious to hear more about it, is this question of shifting our attention to water, because you mentioned that growing up there was this huge body of water that was there, but you didn't necessarily have a way to connect to it. And you also mentioned how maybe paying more attention to water highlights how we're all interconnected. So I'm wondering if you could expand on what happens when you start shifting your attention to this water.
Maybe I'll start by saying like how this happens, because it's, a strange thing that, you and I are both made up of, mostly water. We may go through our whole life without ever really noticing that or paying attention to it. So, what happens when we make this shift? And I think it's important that I also, in my sort of academic career, I'm a humanist. I have studied humanities subjects from, my undergraduate degree was in English literature and feminist theory, and I did philosophy and, dabbled in other humanities and arts subjects. What those taught me, I learned to do what we call close reading of texts usually, or of a film or something like that. And the skill of close reading teaches you to pay attention to what's in the background. What's not maybe the main character of the story, or what's maybe not the main plot line, but what is happening in the background that makes what's happening in the foreground possible? What is the silent backdrop that sort of sets everything in motion? And so that skill of close reading is something that I then translated to understanding my environment, right? If we do a close reading of our environments, we start to notice like water is everywhere, but how are we treating it? Where is it coming from? You could probably walk into a classroom of any sort of ninth grade or maybe even first year or fourth year university students and ask them, where does your water come from that, comes out of the tap? And unless they've explicitly been taught this, probably none of them would know. And I think that's so fascinating. We can background so much. And, as human beings, we need to in order to get through the day. If we paid attention to everything, we'd never get out the front door. But the skill of learning to see what's in the background, to think about it with curiosity and with a critical lens, asking, who benefits from this? What is made invisible here? What is perhaps violated, or how is something, subject to violence by this setup that's in the background? You can get at a lot of questions. You also mentioned, my book with this terribly long title, Post-Human Feminist Phenomenology. Really, phenomenology is close reading of our everyday surroundings, right? That's what phenomenology is. It's a philosophy that asks you to just pay attention to what's there. Bracket out what you think you know, bracket out the dominant narrative you've been told, and use your body in all of its sensory capacities to pay attention to what's there. And then I started to notice things. I noticed that water is very hidden in our, urban infrastructures, but I wanted to know where it came from. I noticed things like when we do have water around us, generally, that brings us pleasure and joy. There's a sensory experience. And of course, that's not the case in times of extreme flooding, or, water is also very dangerous. So I don't want to overgeneralize it. But in the landscape that I grew up in, water was generally a pleasure, a joy, a relief. It was hidden, it was channeled, it was taken out of where it should be and put into other places, usually for the benefit of humans and usually for the benefit only of certain humans. So just by paying attention to these things, we start to understand like all of the infrastructure of the world. And by infrastructure, I don't just mean built infrastructure, but I mean all of the things that make the world work, how nourishment is channeled, how bodies are connected, how evolution happens, how, weather systems circulate around the globe, how cities organize themselves, how communities survive even in the face of extreme difficulty. By following the water, you learn an awful lot about these things.
I'm wondering what an embodied hydrological cycle would look like. What would it look like to describe the cycle and all these infrastructures from an embodied perspective?
Mm-hmm. I think to understand the hydrological cycle as embodied means just inserting all of the biological water, including our own bodies, into that cycle. It also can maybe ask us to appreciate that cycle as very differentiated, that although it does cycle, there are all sorts of eddies and whirlpools and like sort of puddles that water stagnates in. Some of that water goes deep into the earth and stays there for tens of thousands of years. Some settles at the bottom of the ocean and doesn't move similarly until the next millennium happens. Some of that water goes into us and passes through very, very quickly. I mean, the coffee I'm drinking right now is going to leave me probably within an hour. So, some of this water moves very, very quickly. And so you start to understand water as well as like a time-based medium or something like this. Water is constantly also embodying time in different ways. And this kind of cyclicality teaches us something about we do, like living at different time scales simultaneously, in very fast scales, very slow scales, and it also, of course, then teaches us about interconnection. So just sort of complicating that cycle a bit, we can learn all sorts of things about how we are connected to each other. And when I mean we, I mean in the most expansive sense, but also how we're different from each other. And I think that is, from a feminist perspective, probably the most important thing that paying attention to water taught me. Every time water takes on a new body, it becomes different. So it's this like beautiful feminist lesson for me that, really important theorists such as, Gayatri Spivak and Judith Butler, like all sorts of famous feminist theorists have given us ways to try to think about, well, we're connected, but we're different, and difference is important, and difference needs to be valued. And water actually just demonstrates it. It just materializes this theory of connection and difference. Or in a political register, we might talk about it as sovereignty and solidarity, or in different registers, we can call that different things. But for me, most importantly, it doesn't keep us siloed or separate in our little places or bodies or communities or any of that. Like we are inevitably connected through water. Yet water is also what is always coming in new, becoming different, becoming something we never imagined, because that's the way water works. It's always moving and becoming different. So it also says, by paying attention to water, we're not just one big amorphous puddle on the earth. Those differences are really, really important, which, then can point to all sorts of things. How do we use water differently? What kinds of different needs do we have? How does something like weather affect us differently? Like so many justice questions, but also very, mundane everyday life questions start to emerge when we talk about our difference.
I really love how thinking of water is also this opportunity to think about how we're all interconnected and our differences and the things we have in common, but also the social issues that might affect some of us, but not all of us, and like how this might be mediated through the water. And so my next question is about something that I think you also develop in your book, which is the movement of water involved in breastfeeding. I think you mentioned Kathy Cook and the really important work that has to do with what is in this water, where it comes from, who has access to it, and how also it impacts our bodies and the other bodies of water that we are connected to. So I'm wondering if you could expand on this place of breastfeeding and milk as a biological water.
Yeah, it's so interesting. I think I first read that research probably 15 years ago when I sort of stumbled across, I think it was a book by someone named Florence Williams. I think that's her name. And, reading about how women in sort of the 2000s were starting to test their breast milk and find that it was full of all sorts of toxic contaminants, from flame retardants to rocket fuel to pesticides. You know, through the process of biomagnification, all of these toxins that we're exposed to get, magnified in our breast milk and then downloaded to infants that feed from our bodies. So I became interested in this and I started looking into it more. And of course, it should come as no surprise that there are many people who've been thinking about this for a long time. And as you mentioned, the work of Kathy Cook, who had been working on this issue for quite a long time, living in a community in upstate, sort of between Ontario and New York. I believe it was Akwesasne, and being cited, these Indigenous communities cited near big industrial automotive plants on the river, and noticing illness in women. And again, this kind of biomagnification process through breast milk being a really serious problem. And as Kathy Cook kept repeating and sort of became the title of her project, drawn from her own cosmology and science, from her own community. Woman is the first environment, right? That was the slogan, woman as the first environment. And so very much understanding that these bodies are, again, but particularly gendered bodies, right? Like bodies, like we just discussed, bodies are all different. And one of the ways in which we're different is through sex or gender, both, in all sorts of ways, and through our bodily morphology that often aligns with our gender, but not always. So, breastfeeding bodies that breastfeed, have this additional kind of burden. And it's interesting that in the scientific literature, toxic buildup is called body burden. And we can think of this body burden as both a scientific measure, but also an ethical conundrum, like a real ethical challenge to think about. You can imagine a person thinking, I know that my breast milk is the best thing I can give to my infant if I can, but what if it's not? Like, what if it's actually harming my infant because of all of the toxins? So this is, like, in general, a gendered question, but to bring in Kathy Cook's work, I think, is to also show it up as a question of colonialism, environmental justice, and racism, to think about, while this affects all breastfeeding bodies, it affects some much more. And so the Akwesasne community, cited in a very toxically polluted environment on purpose, of course, by colonial governments, puts that burden more on certain communities. And then if we start thinking about, again, the hydrological cycle of water, we learn some really interesting things, like communities in the far north, in the Arctic, Inuk and Inuit communities actually experience. Now, I haven't looked at this research in about 10 years, so I'm not sure if it's still the case, but there was some really troubling research coming out about 15 years ago about the extent to which contaminants were found in the breast milk of women who live in the far north. Especially because, they aren't sited next to a big automotive plant. Like, what's going on here? And what we find out is that through a couple of planetary processes, pollution generated around the middle of the globe, so in the highly industrialized areas, travels by air and by water, again, thinking about those watery cycles, up to the north, where then, again, remembering differences of time, through the slowness of the movement of water in the north, there's an even more intense biomagnification of these toxins in the bodies of mammals. And also because marine mammals are a staple of the diet up there, and the fattiness of those mammals means that those toxins accumulate like really strongly. And so I once read, and again, this research is about 15 years old, but that, a piece of muktuk so marine mammal blubber, about the size of your thumb can introduce more than a lifetime's worth of toxic pollutants into a person's body because they're so biomagnified. And then again, to download them into an infant, then the infant takes it up at an even more intense level. So you get this really strange phenomena where in one of the presumably least polluted parts of the globe, you're actually getting super polluted breast milk because of the hydrological cycle that's more than human, right? That's moving through our waterways, that's moving through the clouds, and that's also moving through marine mammals that, are circulating the globe as well. So oceans being, a vector. I sometimes think through the idea of water not only as a connector, like we've already talked about, but as a communicator. Water is a vector that is bringing all sorts of things to other bodies, to other parts of the globe, to other environments. And in the case of breast milk, water is bringing those toxins to the first environment, the woman's body.
It's so interesting, as you just said, when you look at not only what is in the water, but also how it connects us, as you said. And I think you also mentioned this concept of the more than human, because maybe we tend, when we say we, to think, okay, but who are the bodies of water? Maybe this is about thinking of us humans as bodies of water and what happens with this. But you introduce this really interesting concept of being more transdisciplinary and looking at all the bodies and what constitutes a body. So I'm wondering if you could tell us more about the more than human and maybe the agency of these different bodies, and also what happens when we start questioning the we and who gets to be part of this we when we think of water.
When I started to think about all of us as bodies of water, it conversely invited me to think about water as always embodied. So through this kind of close reading or phenomenological approach, one thing I came up against was the idea of water as kind of an abstraction. There's no such thing as just water. Like water always takes a body, whether it's a lake or a cloud or vapor or a human or a kitten or, a flower or, a pair of jeans. All of these things are embodiments of water. And for me, that was really important because then it had to sort of open up how I understood bodies. If water is always taking a body, there's no such thing as totally just pure water in the world, like it never exists in that form anywhere, then what does it mean to talk about bodies of water? Well, bodies of water are human, they're animal, they're fungal, they're vegetable, they are geological, they are atmospheric, they are meteorological. And so I started to really sort of expand how I understood bodies. And, what does that teach me? Well, again, we're back to the question of difference and, how these different bodies affect each other and who has control. I also, without getting overly philosophical, it sort of got me thinking about, water as having its own desires, like different. When water takes up a certain body, it wants to fulfill itself. And, this is something I learned from reading other people, for example, Anishinaabe science on water, Anishinaabe philosophy that understands also the waters to have their own responsibility. I'm not an expert in this. Don't quote me on this. I'm not an Anishinaabe knowledge holder, but from what I understand and what I've read, I understand this idea of, if we have a responsibility to the water also has a responsibility to us. So a river has a responsibility to flow and to bring fish and to, do other things that rivers do, bring sediment out, along and move it, be that connector like we talked about. So every body has its own responsibilities, every body of water. And then I, started to think about that also, as I said, in terms of its desires. Like, what does a river want? What does an ocean want? What does a rain cloud want? And when we start to think about all of these different human and non-human bodies of water as having their own desire, then we come up to the word agency that you mentioned, and what is agency except this kind of propulsion or desire or energy or force, right? To do something, to be something, to move in a way, to change something, to interrupt something. And all bodies of water have that kind of agency.
I'm wondering, in terms of ethics and like practically what it means once we start understanding ourselves and those that we relate to as bodies of water, and what it means in terms of being connected but different to them. I'm wondering what this can mean ethically and what can be sort of the political implications of thinking of these bodies of water as agents and having this sort of reciprocity being weaved into it.
Yeah, it's a really good question because I suppose the theory of, we are all bodies of water is a beautiful idea, but what does that actually mean in the world? And how can it actually be also a methodological guide, if you will, for political and ethical action? And I think this can show up in so many different ways, but one way that I've been thinking about it recently, and sometimes with students in my classrooms, is drawing on Métis scholar Max Liboiron's book, Pollution is Colonialism. In that book, they talk about specificity and obligations. And they say that, depending on how you are specifically located, you're going to have specific obligations. So as a teacher standing in front of my classroom, I have certain obligations to my students. As a mother in my home, I have certain obligations to my children. So look, how you are specifically in relation to your location means your obligations might be different. And so I've taken this idea and I thought, so how can we use this idea of specificity and obligations to think about ourselves as watery bodies connected to other watery bodies? And I'm sure you're aware that something that has become a commonplace action in many classrooms and events and things like this is to offer a land acknowledgement if one is not Indigenous to the lands that we're on. So I'm asking now, in my classrooms and at my place of work, like if we are giving a land acknowledgement, acknowledging, for example, that right now I am here on the unceded and stolen territories of the Syilx people, that's a specific location. And what does it obligate me to? The Syilx have a water declaration that talks about the importance of Syilx, which is the idea of water in Silixian language. And reading that water declaration, which talks about various kinds of responsibilities towards water, the power of water in this specific place that is actually a high country desert, although it has an abundance of water coursing through it in the form of glacial lakes. There's a very specific relationship between humans and animals and plants and the lands and the waters in this place. So when I give that land acknowledgement, I can think about, well, if I'm going to acknowledge and be grateful for this land and these waters that I reside on, as entirely uninvited, what is my specific obligation to caring for these waters, right? So we can bring it to a very personal level and thinking about, my daily actions, things like that. But that's also a political question. How am I supporting Syilx sovereignty and governance as the knowledge holders and with the best and most developed knowledge about environmental stewardship in this place? So it's both a personal question, it's a political question. Again, we're back to the question of solidarity. And I am sharing in these waters, even though I'm very different from people who have lived here since time immemorial. But how can I enact that solidarity through various concrete actions in my life? So there's always a way to make these questions specific, and they're always, specific in the place. I think this is the other thing about, thinking with water is it gives us a way to embody that political idea of local and global, the simultaneity of being very locally in a place, thinking from a very place-based and land-based perspective, but also understanding that those questions are always connected to what's happening globally. And we see that again very materially because the water that is in the place that I'm talking to you from right now is part of the Columbia River watershed. So it will travel down into the US. It will be, diverted and channeled and dammed and used for all sorts of agricultural purposes. It will dry up where it's not supposed to. It will flood where it's not supposed to. If we're lucky, and thanks to the efforts of Indigenous people here, it will be the home of the kokanee salmon run again, which, is back after many years of not being healthy, which is amazing. So, there are all those local things, and then they connect out globally. We can also think about how these water issues here on Silk Territory connect me to something like the ongoing genocide in Palestine right now, which is very much also about water and about power and what will be done in order to get access to land and water. So to think about a slogan such as "From the river to the sea," I think is a beautiful connector to connect colonial politics where I'm living to those devastating manifestations of colonial politics elsewhere in the world. So again, if we follow the water, we can see how we are connected to our local, in which we are very firmly embedded, but never separate from those global questions that also circulate around us.
I think that's actually a lovely closing statement because you brought together so many of the different things we discussed today, and I think you beautifully linked how our local embodied experience is also linked to global dynamics and how paying attention to water can sort of highlight this interconnectedness and the difference, and how our actions and how we decide to live in this world can have all these different implications. So thank you so much for being here today and for having this conversation. It was absolutely fascinating, and I'm really grateful for that.
Well, I'm very happy to have had the opportunity to meet you and to speak with you, and maybe one day to meet you in person as well.
Thank you for listening to this episode. We hope you enjoyed it. You can find all of our other episodes online on our platforms, as well as in our listening room in our exhibition space in Brooklyn, New York. Bye!